Hi, I'm Javian, and this is
Elijah, and this is Dr. Robertson.
Hi, my name is Dr Robertson. I'm an associate professor of African American literature and critical race studies.
Okay, so let's get started, shall we?
Okay. Here's some questions about convict leasing we have for you. So, is there any reference to convict leasing in the literature you study?
Yes, convict leasing, because I teach African American literature, and convict leasing primarily occurred during Reconstruction. That's right after the Civil War, and it pertained primarily to African Americans. Then it's going to show up often in African American sociology and occasionally in African American literature proper. So individuals like W.E.B. Du Bois, who is going to be one of the greatest scholars of the 20th century. He wrote an incredible text called The Negro in Crime. And in The Negro in Crime, he documents the way in which convict leasing is utilized by the southern states in order to replace the labor of slavery.
Question to you. What are your thoughts on convict leasing? Was it bad in the first place, or was it a decent idea?
That's a really good question. Well, W.E.B. Du Bois is going to argue that, of course, it's necessarily bad, as well as contemporary scholars like Michelle Alexander. She wrote a famous book called The New Jim Crow, where she takes Dr. Du Bois's thesis, and Dr. Alexander says, but this idea is still going on. Well, the primary purpose for convict leasing was that with the advent of the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery in the United States, we were left with all these southern and Gulf states who now lost all track. They had no ability to make people work anymore. And they didn't believe that these newly freed African American citizens would willfully go back to work for them. So they constructed a system through the judicial system, through the court system, so that they can, in essence, recapture that population and force them to work. So the way that it answers your question is that the very notion of convict leasing was already a kind of evil intent. There was no good ever directly connected to it, primarily because it was going to demonize, that was turn African American, and especially African American men, into criminals. They were going to make them monsters as a justification for putting them in jail so that they could use them as labor. Equally so, it's going to pervert the judicial system so that other kinds of criminals, maybe Caucasian men or even Asian American women, would not be prosecuted because there wouldn't be enough room for them, because you're utilizing the convict leasing system to capture so many people at one time. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
What are your thoughts on convict leasing?
So my thoughts on convict leasing is that convict leasing is an excellent example of the way in which race is going to change with time. So the idea of race, that is that race is a construct, it's an idea that allows some people to justify their oppressive or aggressive action toward other people. The 13th Amendment says, well, just because these people have a different history and just because they have a different skin color than you, you can't do that anymore. Well, that doesn't mean that race goes away. It just means that race takes on a different shape. So now, instead of talking about black people or Negro people the way they were spoken of then, those same people get turned into criminals or convicts. So to be Negro and to be a convict was actually the exact same thing. But because one form got outlawed, you could not any longer discriminate against Negroes, but you could discriminate against convicts. And so it became a new form of racism, although at the same time it hid racism. Does that make sense? So we get racism without racist at exactly the same time.
So, how do you think convict leasing has progressed over time?
So it progresses over time. In the original form, primarily African American men and women were convicted of a crime, usually something petty, like you were walking on the railroad and you weren't allowed to walk on the railroad. Or you were walking down the street and you looked like you were homeless. So just because you look like it, it didn't mean that you actually were. Then you could be captured, brought into the judicial system, convicted of a crime, then placed immediately. Back then, we didn't have huge jails and we didn't even have prisons, right? So we're in about the 1860s, the 1880s. So large jails like the ones we have downtown, they didn't exist. So we would simply take that individual and place them in the care of somebody else. So you would go straight from the police officer arresting you, and they would literally give you to some farmer. And that farmer's job was to keep you shackled, to keep you controlled, and force you to work on his field. Well, eventually, about the 1890s, we decided as a country that maybe that wasn't such a good idea, because the state, the law, was really no part of the process. There was an officer, and then you were working on a farm. So then we started building jails and prisons, and then those prisons just became a place for us to house you. So we would put you in these large dormitories, and then we would, some business would come and say, hey, I need people for my cotton fields. And we'd say, okay, we're going to send you 10 convicts, which usually meant 10 people of color. And we would send them out, and you would work for them, and then you'd come back to our dorm, and you'd sleep at night. So the system has slowly evolved, but even today in Huntsville, Texas, large jail systems. In Sugar Land, Texas, just down the street, large jail systems. And in those jail systems, prisoners make furniture that we sell, and our state makes a profit off of it. Did you know that all of the buses for our public schools that you guys ride on every day, those tires and those engines are all made by prisoners?
That's pretty cool.
So the school system itself is supported by prison labor. That convict leasing it's still happening. It's still alive today. So that sometimes when you pick up a piece of furniture and on the bottom of it says made in the USA, oftentimes that means it's made in a USA prison, because prisoners made that cheap product.
What are some reasons to support or oppose convict leasing?
Well, there's almost no reasons to support convict leasing. The idea that we often have in society is, hey, these people have committed a crime, well, they need to work because we need to house them. Well, many of the reasons that people commit crime is not because they're bad people. The reason that we usually steal is because we need it to eat, or we need clothes to wear, or we need transportation. So if you actually want to address crime, then you have to address poverty, right? So if we can alleviate some of the pressure of poverty, then we, by necessity, alleviate some of the crime. Does that make sense? So, or let's say you go to a really bad school system and you don't get a good education, but all the jobs require that you're really smart. Well, now we've set you up to fail. You're not going to make enough money to survive. You're not going to be happy working in really low-wage jobs, so you are going to find a way to get the things that you need. So now we're back at crime. So instead of investing money in prison leasing, maybe we need to put more money in schools so that young men and women get an opportunity to make the best of themselves. So really there's no real good reason for prison leasing. Even if you're a person who has a psychological disorder, that you're struggling mentally, you working in a field or making furniture or putting tires on a bus is not going to fix that. You need to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist, or you need therapy. Work is not going to fix that. So the prison leasing system is actually a form of punishment. It's not a form of reformation. It's not actually fixing the problem, it's actually hurting the person. And those are two totally different things. So we have to decide as a society, are we going to fix the problem, like our schools, like our poor communities, like the problems that we have inside of our judicial system, or are we going to punish people for being poor, or are we going to punish people for not getting an education? So with that in mind, there are no really good reasons for prison leasing, but there are really good reasons for not having prison leasing. Prison leasing also allows the state of Texas to now put furniture into the market that it paid very little money for. So all of the other people who are not in prison are making furniture, and their furniture is going to be much more expensive, right? Because those workers had to make it on the outside. But the prison has all these captured people, and it's forcing them to work at very low wages. Oftentimes, a prisoner may only make a quarter a day. A quarter a day. But I'll sell the same chair for $200, which means the state of Texas makes a lot of profit. That profit that the state of Texas makes is going to keep the other people who are making chairs in our society. Now their chairs are too expensive to buy because the state of Texas can make their chairs for much cheaper. So not only does it hurt the prisoners because it doesn't allow them to rehabilitate to get what they need, it hurts the economy as well. Excellent.
So, what types of things did African Americans, men and women that were African American, write about in their literature?
In their literature. So, again, we have W.E.B. Du Bois. He writes in his sociological pieces where he literally compares the numbers and compares the costs. That's in some of the early work. But also in some of the literature from Reconstruction, from right after slavery, we'll see moments where individuals are in the South and they get caught in prison, or they end up getting caught for, like I said, anything like walking on the railroad tracks, and they get thrown in prison. Not for maybe 2 days, but they go away for 5 years because they were walking on the railroad tracks. Or they were caught sleeping outside, which is against the law. It's against the law to be homeless. But yet we won't give them jobs so they can afford homes. So then they get thrown in jail for long periods of time, and they end up working on these gangs. And so their job was to help in the fields. And so we see moments in the literature where especially African American men are a part of these work gangs that they are on. So we see it in the literature often.
Okay. From what time period is the literature you study? Is it close to the time of convict leasing?
Right. So my primary field of study is from about the Civil War, right? So this is W.E.B. Du Bois, from about 1860 all the way to the present. So really my work fits well within your subject of convict leasing.
So, where do the African Americans who wrote about the literature you study come from? Were they from pro or con convict lease states?
Well, they come from lots of different places. So many Southern writers, we'll see it in, we see it in the work of Richard Wright, or we'll see it in the work of Zora Neale Hurston, and her famous Their Eyes Are Watching God. Zora's from Florida, and Richard Wright is from Mississippi. But W.E.B. Du Bois, he's from Massachusetts. But that's another thing. The northern states engaged in the same thing. So Massachusetts has a convict leasing agreement just like Texas does. So it's not simply a north-south thing, it's all over the country.
Okay.
Alrighty, well, that will end our interview. Thank you.
Oh, well, it's the least I could do. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate it. Wonderful to meet you.
Same.
And that is all for Rob, Javian, and Elijah.